It's my privilege today to introduce Geoffrey Yeo, who's our keynote speaker. And Geoffrey has come from far afield on his first trip to Australia, so we make him warmly welcome. And I think we're going to have a very interesting session to start the conference with. Geoffrey's had a distinguished career as an archivist and academic, both teacher and researcher in archives and records. He's worked at the University College London for a number of years and remains affiliated with the college as an honorary researcher. He's also had a stint at the University of British Columbia as a visiting professor in their School of Library, Archives and Information Studies. He's previously worked as an archivist at the City of London, St Bartholomew's Hospital, the Royal College of Physicians, amongst others, and in addition to having a career as a consultant as archivist and records manager. Interestingly, he's also been a consultant to the International Records Management Trust, participating in records management and education projects in places such as Gambia, Ghana, Botswana and Uganda. And he's contributed educational materials for use in developing countries too, in that capacity. So we're very fortunate to have Geoffrey with us, and I know you'll make him warmly welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Kylie, and good morning, everyone. I'd really like to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak at this conference. It is an honour and a pleasure to be with you today. When I was asked if I would give the opening presentation at a conference on archives on the edge, I wasn't immediately sure what I should speak about. What makes archives edgy? Are they on the edge of a precipice or the edge of a great and successful future? After some thought, the topic I decided to address is the connection of archives to the world of information and to the global information society in which we supposedly find ourselves. Must archives and records be consigned to the edge in an age of ubiquitous digital information, or can they still occupy a central role? Are archival and record-keeping approaches now in danger of redundancy, as some pundits have claimed? Or does the management of archives and records offer a distinct edge in the information society of the 21st century? According to its proponents, the information society is a new type of society in which technological tools manage unprecedented quantities of information, and economies are characterized by a post-industrial workforce that uses information in creative ways. To many in the popular media and in political circles, this is a powerful message. Many commentators tell us that the information society is already here. But for others, it remains work in progress. The UN World Summit on the Information Society met in 2003 and declared its, quote, commitment to build an information society where everyone can create, access, utilize, and share information and knowledge. The study published in 2013 affirmed that the information society is still unfolding. It is the subject of an annual conference, and a World Summit Forum was held in Geneva earlier this year. Are archivists at the edge of these developments? The various conferences and forums are targeted chiefly at computer scientists, who now seem to be the main proponents of an information society. Over the years, I don't know how many times I've heard that archivists must immediately follow whatever seems to be the latest trend, or else risk being marginalized. As long ago as 1998, UNESCO's Director of Informatics told the International Council on Archives that if archives remain as, quote, mere repositories of historical records, end quote, they will be condemned to operate on the margins of the information society. Instead, he said, they should become central information and content providers for the sake of the common good. More recently, one of the proposals of the World Summit was to develop policies to ensure that archives and other cultural institutions can participate in the information society. What seems clear is that ideas about the value and importance of information have proliferated across the world in recent years. And the increasing emphasis on information has been reflected in many ways in our profession, not least in professional education, where the study of information now often seems to predominate over the study of records and archives. 50 years ago, my university in London had a school of librarianship and archives, but this school is now called the Department of Information Studies, and its website describes archives and records management as, quote, information disciplines. Here in Australia, the majority of the accredited courses in records and archives management seem to be bachelor's, master's, or diplomas in information studies, information management, or information systems. Moreover, in the last few years, several records management organisations have changed their names. The Records Management Society of Great Britain has become the Information and Records Management Society. The Records Management Association of Australasia is now Records and Information Management Professionals Australasia. And in the USA, members of ARMA International have also largely rejected the term records management in favour of records and information management. Some of you may know Google's Ngram viewer, which can measure the frequency of particular terms in the books that Google have scanned. And I thought you might like to see how Ngram viewer depicts the rise of the term records management in literature of the 1970s and 80s, and its declining use since the 90s. It also shows the growing popularity of the phrase records and information management over the same period. And having largely replaced records by records and information, the next step for many professional organisations has been to move towards abandoning the word records altogether. In 1999, ARMA International dropped records from the title of its journal. And 3 years later, it issued a booklet addressing what it would once have called records management under the title Information Management, a Business Imperative. In Britain, the mission statement of the Information and Records Management Society no longer mentions records at all. The society now aims to be, quote, the home of all those engaged in the management or utilisation of information. And in case you're still in doubt about the direction taken by the organisation that was once called the Records Management Society, here is the ad for its 2015 conference. Well, I'm not sure that these changes are in any real sense an attempt to link records management to the scientific study of information, its retrieval, users, and uses. For all the talk about records and information management, most of its practitioners seem content to remain ignorant of the world of information science and continue to focus their efforts on designing retention schedules, implementing movements through the phases of a life cycle, and other traditional records management concerns. So what is going on? Is this anything more than an attempt by records professionals to climb aboard an information bandwagon? Many records managers certainly think that information has a broader appeal than records. They see the language of information as a way of bolstering their professional profile, enhancing their influence, and overcoming the poor visibility of records management. These aspirations are supported by a cultural and economic environment in which governments and commercial interests constantly promote information. Advertisements regularly tell us that information is the most valuable commodity in business. A UK government publication claims that information is the lifeblood of almost every service we use as citizens. And as Theodore Roszak has noted, before the Second World War, information was nothing to get excited about. But since then, it has had what he calls a rags to riches career and has come to be connected with a historic transition in our economic life. Thanks to Google, we can trace the relative fortunes of the words information and record over the last 140 years, and the rising popularity of information in published literature since the 1940s in another n-gram. I hope everyone can see that information is tracked in blue and the usage of record is tracked in red in the lower part of the graph. And as you can see, the fate of the two words has been very different. Above all, the word information now evokes the world of computing. Computer scientists see themselves as purveyors of information systems. They use the terms information technology or information and communication technologies to reiterate their informational role. The predominant image of computing is of a field that is vibrant, exciting, and surrounded by big money. And records professionals are inevitably tempted to employ the language of information technology in the hope that some of the resources and influence it attracts will come their way. But in many respects, records managers' enthusiasm for information can be seen as a response not just to the growth of digital technology or to vague notions of an information society, but to what we might call the compliance agenda. In many countries, the arrival of measures to enhance transparency in government, and especially of laws that purport to give citizens rights of access to information, has been an important factor. Some commentators observe that citizens usually gain access to records rather than information, but legislators generally assume that information is the right word to use. In the USA, a similar transition has occurred in connection with the growth of e-discovery. A significant community of e-discovery specialists has emerged, and members of this community usually speak of the discovery of electronically stored information, or ESI, rather than electronic records. One recent American publication claims that ESI was the factor that, quote, changed the science of records management to the point that a new term, records and information management, had to be coined. Legal and regulatory compliance and the need to preserve and locate records required for litigation have long been recognised as crucial areas in records management, but have recently been bundled up with a broader range of concerns that are often labelled information governance. And as you can see, this is a term that has come to sudden prominence in the 21st century. It was well established in the health sector by 2004, and it seems to have come to the notice of mainstream records managers about 2010. Since then, it has been enthusiastically adopted by the e-discovery community in the USA and by many records management practitioners and professional bodies. So what is information governance? Some say it's just a rebranding of records management, but others say it embraces a wider range of interests. The Information Governance Initiative has published this graphic. Some of you may be familiar with it. It suggests that information governance includes not only the compliance and privacy issues familiar to records professionals, but also things like information security, which are more usually associated with managing IT systems. Many commentators say that records management is being, or should be, absorbed into information governance. And particularly in North America, it has become commonplace to assert that this change has now occurred. ARMA International, an organization that was founded to promote records management, now affirms that its goals are to support and establish leadership in information governance. So records management, it seems, has been overtaken by more exciting developments in the world of information. What about archival institutions that keep records primarily for cultural reasons? In some quarters, similar trends can be observed. I've already mentioned how UNESCO promoted the message that archives should embrace the information society. In 2000, the UK government announced that it expected the archives sector to, quote, adapt itself to the information revolution, end quote. And in 2008, the chief executive of the UK's National Archives said that her organisation needed to shift from records to information, and claimed that all archives are about managing and enabling access to information. Some might argue that archives are at least as much about evidence or about memory as they are about information. But in UK government circles, it is the rhetoric of information that has prevailed. The language of the information age has also been used to support arguments that archival institutions should converge with libraries, museums, and galleries. Some have argued a case for convergence based on a shared interest in cultural heritage or memory. But for many advocates of convergence, the unifying factors are the beliefs that archives, libraries, and museums all deal with information, and that their staff all belong to information-focused professions. This line of thinking was developed by Boyd Rayward, who affirmed that such institutions are all components of what he called information infrastructure, differentiated only by the format of the materials they hold. The decisive factor is usually said to be the digital revolution. Many convergence advocates now argue that technology leads users to expect seamless access to records, museum objects, and library materials. Some affirm that when materials are digital, they no longer fall into these distinct conceptual categories, so that separate curatorial institutions are no longer needed. Maybe. Like records managers, archivists have sometimes seemed keen to embrace the new role that information society enthusiasts have mapped out for them. In the 1980s, James Rhodes, former US National Archivist, claimed that both current records and historical archives form an essential part of a nation's information resources and should be parts of the national information system. In the UK, Michael Cook has long argued that archives have a place within the field of information management. And in 2011, Nicole Convery advocated what she called, quote, an inclusive view of the realm of archivists as part of the wider information management arena, end quote. The UK Archives and Records Association has recently joined a lobbying group for associations that will affirm the value and benefits of information for the individual, organisation, and society. Some archivists have warned of the risks of embracing an information agenda. Stephen Harries contends that there is a danger that the concept of records becomes diluted in a sea of information. And Richard Cox has asked rhetorically, quote, how many times have records professionals been duped into thinking that their primary responsibility is information rather than records, end quote. Nevertheless, the prevailing view in much of Europe and North America seems to be, as Bruno Delmas put it, that, quote, the society of information in which we are today compels us to reconsider archival science, end quote. So, does this mean that records and information are now largely synonymous terms? That archives and record keeping can no longer make a distinctive contribution? And that records managers, and perhaps archivists too, should simply become generic information managers? Many practitioners seem to think so, and use the words records and information interchangeably. Statements such as records management is focused on the management of information are now common in records management literature. Another possibility is that those who speak of records and information management believe that records and information are closely associated but not identical. But few enthusiasts for records and information management have addressed the questions of how records and information are connected and in what ways they differ. And this morning, I want to unpick some aspects of the concepts of information and records to see whether distinctions between them remain valid in the contemporary world. Many published standards offer definitions of records that affirm a relationship to information. For example, the International Standard for Archival Description defines records as, quote, recorded information in any form or medium created or received and maintained by an organisation or person in the transaction of business or the conduct of affairs. I'm sure you recognise that definition. Scholarly literature sometimes promotes a similar view. Archival educator Theo Thomason characterises records as process-bound information. For Gillian Oliver, they are information as evidence. Others equate records to information deemed to have some enduring value, unpublished information objects, or internally generated proprietary information. In each case, the authors imply that records are a kind of information and suggest how they can be distinguished from other kinds of information. They are said to be information that is unpublished, or proprietary, or evidential, or linked to work processes, or of continuing value. Despite the apparent unanimity that records are a kind of information, there is a lot of variation when it comes to telling us what kind of information they are supposed to be. However, not everyone agrees that records are a kind of information. Some professionals have preferred to define them as a kind of evidence and emphasise their role in supporting organisational accountability. I scarcely need to mention that Australian writings have often emphatically characterised records as evidence of business activities. Some writers have argued that records are more than information, or are not information at all. In the 90s, Terry Cook and Glenda Ackland forcefully promoted the view that archivists are in the understanding business, not the information business. But in the new millennium, these voices are muted. The linkage of records with information is common, both in Europe and in North America. Even here in Australia, the National Archives website now says that records management is essential to ensure that business information is well managed. I see that the National Archives' new capability matrix hardly mentions evidence at all. It addresses the capabilities needed to manage what it calls digital information and records, and it states that the National Archives is responsible for advising government agencies on how to improve information management. The record-keeping informatics approach, now being promoted by a number of academics in Australia and New Zealand, seems, if I interpret it correctly, to conceptualise record-keeping as a specialised form of information management, and to have adopted the word informatics in order to situate record-keeping in an information environment. Another notion records managers sometimes propose is that particular information can, or should, be managed as a record. And this notion is linked to the view that records need to be managed in special ways to ensure their integrity. Traditionally, this was done by moving or capturing records into a formal record-keeping system, although lately it has been argued that capture isn't essential and records can be safeguarded in the business systems where they originate. Adherents of capture in the UK and North America often restrict the term records to captured materials. Until recently, they usually labelled uncaptured digital items as documents. Documents deemed important were declared as records when they were captured in an electronic record-keeping system. Today, however, the word document seems to have fallen out of favour. Increasingly, we are told that it is information that can be declared as a record and managed according to special rules. In the last few years, many who take this view have begun to argue that organisations need to control the whole of their information, not just information for which special rules have been deemed necessary. Proponents argue that all of an organisation's information is discoverable in litigation, that where privacy or freedom of information laws are in force, all of it is subject to those laws, and that users are unlikely to care whether information has been declared as a record or not. Of course, notions that information can be declared or managed as a record are largely unknown outside the records management community, and even among records managers, this mode of thinking isn't universally shared. Our response to it, and indeed our response to the more general idea that records are a kind of information, will largely depend on our understandings of what is meant by information and what is meant by a record. And although I've been talking about the use of these terms by records managers, these are important questions for archivists too. I'll come back to understandings of record later in my talk. First, I will explore some possible meanings of information. The extensive literature on this topic is largely inconclusive. Dictionaries offer many definitions of information, mostly variations on the themes of communicative acts and imparted knowledge. Information is said to be that of which one is apprised or told, or the act of informing, or intelligence given. No one seems to be sure exactly what information is, but it has traditionally been seen as abstract and intangible. A more recent interpretation, however, sees it rather differently, as a thing, a material form into which intelligence is encoded. In the early 1990s, the information scientist Michael Buckland noted that the word information is increasingly used attributively for objects regarded as informative. This view of information is of fairly recent origin and is barely recognised in the dictionaries I consulted. However, it's important to my topic this morning, and I want to spend a little time exploring it further. Although it wasn't explicitly discussed until the 90s, the notion that information is a material thing or object can be traced several decades earlier. The term information retrieval is said to have been invented in 1950 by Calvin Moores. However, the systems that Moores promoted were designed to retrieve books and documents, and critics complained that Moores had confused information with literature. Users had needs for information which might be met by matching their requests to books or other items in a library, but it was far from clear that the books themselves could be said to constitute the information they sought. However, many librarians found it convenient to position libraries as repositories of information rather than repositories of books. And Buckland's formulation of information as thing appeared to legitimize this. The growth of digital technology offered further encouragement, since it seemed to promise a world where tangible items such as books would be increasingly removed from the equation. A different approach to information addresses information flow, the idea that information has movements that can be tracked. In the 70s and 80s, computer scientists developed information flow models for office environments. Since the 90s, computer science has tended to address workflow rather than information flow. But notions of information flow persist in library and information studies, where they are often associated with information audit, the formal examination of the use and movement of information within an organization. Understandings of information as a thing also underlie the notion of information resource management, which originated as a term to describe the management of documents, data, and IT in US government agencies. In the 80s, ideas about information resource management were adopted by many in the library and information field, often with an emphasis on quantifying the value of information in monetary terms. This line of thinking was taken further in 1995, when a group of business leaders in the UK proposed that an organisation's significant information should be identified as an asset. In the 21st century, the phrase information asset management has replaced resource management in the dominant discourse, and there has been much talk about valuations of information assets appearing on company balance sheets. Well, although the protagonists in this area have largely come from the library and information field, their vocabulary has been increasingly influential in the world of records management. For example, records managers who once spoke of a records survey now often use the term information audit to give their language a more corporate tone. And since the 80s, many writers have promoted connections between records management and information resource or asset management. In the 90s, Richard Kesner extended the argument to archives and proclaimed that, quote, archivists must move with the times and deliver information resource management services, end quote. Catherine Hare and Julie MacLeod argued that records are the key manifestation of an organization's information asset. In 2009, Randy Kahn affirmed that records are often referred to as information assets. All these approaches are predicated on understanding information as a thing. If it is abstract, it cannot easily be a manageable commodity. However, assumptions that information can be quantified, audited, or governed remain open to question. What if information resides in people's minds, as well as, or instead of, on tangible or digital media? If it is found on a medium, can we equate it with the content inscribed on the medium, or the meaning of that content, the ideas that the content conveys? These possibilities suggest that we may have to consider the objects practitioners manage and systematize not as information per se, but as entities from which information can be derived. Back in 1980, some computer scientists asked in what sense information can flow around an organisation. And in a pre-automated era, they interpreted information flow as the flow of forms. Information was collected on forms, and the forms moved from one place to another. From this perspective, it is the information carrier that flows or travels around the organisation. The information is not the form itself, but its content. And similarly, there is a resilient strand in archival thinking which sees information as the content of a record. Timothy Spray, for example, says that, quote, records contain information set down in the context of business operations. The purpose of records management, says Spray, is to render the information contained in the records more accessible. So, the simple view is that when records are well managed, the information held or set down in them is unproblematically available to users. Some, however, take a more nuanced view. For Harris, records are artifacts containing information, but users have to make sense of the information they contain. Information is open to interpretation, and the user has to contribute something to its understanding. We could also argue that information does not reside in records, that it is intangible, or arises only in the minds and intellects of individuals. From this perspective, the sense-making activity that Harris describes creates information, rather than merely tries to make sense of information that already exists. Information, then, is a matter of what users can infer from reading a record, or perhaps from interacting with its context and structure, as well as its content. Information, then, is not something that records are, or something they unproblematically contain, but something we derive from using them. Information is an affordance that records provide to users, and each user can acquire different information from the same record. Records have also frequently been said to provide evidence, and archivists often affirm that both information and evidence are benefits that records can supply. So, the website of the National Archives of Australia, for example, says that records provide, at the bottom of the screen there, information for planning and decision-making, and evidence of government accountability. Of course, we can also identify other affordances of records, including memory, accountability, senses of personal or social identity, as well as ideas, inspirations, and guidance for future action. Not all users of records and archives seek information. Different users discover different affordances. If you perceive information as belonging to the sphere of the mind, you will be unlikely to accept claims that information and records are synonymous, that records are a kind of information, or that information is unproblematically embedded in records. It's plausible that records can be quantified, surveyed, and controlled. But if information is an affordance records provide to users, it isn't the kind of commodity that we can hope to manage or govern. Well, I had hoped to say something this morning about data. After all, if you believe the pundits, we live not only in an information society, an age of information, but in an age of data. When records professionals in Europe consider data, they often think of data protection law, whose connections to records are well established. But discourse about data has recently extended to big data, open data, and other flavors of data that are also arguably connected to record keeping. Is it possible that records, rather than being a kind of information, might be identified as a kind of data? Well, some people certainly think so. For example, this data science website claims that educational, employment, social security, and other records are all, quote, types of administrative data, end quote. But unfortunately, my time this morning is limited, so I'm going to have to leave full examination of claims like these for another occasion. All I will say today is that data can be a slippery concept, and that one of my biggest difficulties with seeing records as either information or data is the association of information and data with notions of fact. Many definitions of data describe them as raw facts. Computing textbooks give examples of customers' addresses, employees' names, or the numbers of units on a production line. Information, too, is sometimes described as a collection of facts. According to one textbook, information is not subjective or biased, but factual and impartial. All of this presupposes a world in which data and information are context independent, and language always corresponds to an external reality. But growing numbers of scholars argue that data are constructed and are always dependent on the practices used to generate them. According to Lisa Gittelman, quote, despite the ubiquity of the phrase raw data, data are always already cooked and never entirely raw. Well, the data in the n-grams that I showed you earlier were certainly cooked. The numbers that underlie those graphs don't come directly from the books that Google scanned, but from normalization algorithms imposed by the software designers. And the numbers underlying the usage trends for record are likely to include references to gramophone records or Olympic records. The data that I gave you are not as simple as they look. But what about the example I mentioned a few minutes ago? Customers' addresses. Surely those are factual and context independent? Unfortunately not. When you're presented with the datum that Fred's address is Rose Villa, you can still ask what this means. Does Fred live there all the time? Or might it be his second home? What is his address on the nights when he stays in a hotel? What are you to make of the datum that Fred's address is a post office box number? Data always emerge from perceptions of the world. So, I want to suggest that records are not simply information or bearers of facts. I want to conclude this talk by suggesting that they are representations. More specifically, they are representations of what I have called occurrence. Occurrence are phenomena that have temporal endings, and records represent them in an enduring manner. They remain available after the occurrence has ceased. Records are usually associated with activities and transactions, but we can have records of other occurrence, statements made, questions asked, feelings expressed. In each case, the occurrent lacks intrinsic persistence, but the record is a continuing representation of it. Let me say just a bit more about representations. The first thing to note is that the representational view rejects notions that records come into existence by being declared or designated for special treatment. It characterizes them not by decisions about retention, but by their relation to occurrence in the world. Records may cross what Barbara Reid has called thresholds of formality at various points in their lives, but the crossing of these thresholds does not determine their status as records. I certainly agree with those who contend that records managers need to cast their net more widely than the declaration approach permits, but the wider environment to which they must attend is not an environment of information, but a wider environment of records and representations. Some information scientists recognize a role for representation. Rather than telling us that data are facts, some say that data represent facts. And information, too, is occasionally defined as a representation of reality. But I want to argue that to understand textual records as representations, we need to dig a bit more deeply and to look at some ideas that have challenged the assumption that the sole function of language is to transmit information. These are ideas that can enhance our understanding of how records work. Here are some documents whose role at first sight seems purely informational. One affirms that the sky is blue, the other that Perth is 3,000 kilometres from Sydney. But we may want to ask, where did these documents come from? Who is telling us these things? In fact, I wrote them when I was preparing this talk. In writing, as in speaking, we do not merely supply information, we make statements of things we believe to be true or plausible. In this example, when I wrote Perth is 3,000 kilometres from Sydney, I could have written, I state that Perth is 3,000 kilometres from Sydney, but the shorter form of words seemed easier and more convenient. Now, consider this letter from a builder. Like the sky is blue and Perth is 3,000 kilometres from Sydney, I have fixed the roof appears to be simply a piece of information, a supposed fact. But more correctly, it is a statement of that fact by Bob the Builder. Rather than including an unnecessary phrase such as, I state that, Bob has merely set out the proposition he intended to state. Nevertheless, Bob's signature, or his name on the letterhead, indicates that he represents himself as stating the proposition that he has fixed the roof. The letter is a representation not merely of fixing the roof, but of Bob making the statement that he has fixed it. By sending the letter, Bob performed the act of making this statement. The letter is a record because the representations persist after the act has been performed. Of course, almost any proposition that speakers or writers make can be open to dispute. Perhaps the sky really is blue, but perhaps it only appears so to human observers. Perhaps the distance from Sydney to Perth depends on the route you take. propositions often express perceptions of the world rather than empirically verifiable facts. And we should be similarly cautious about propositions stated in records which purport to tell of past events. Perhaps Bob really has fixed the roof, but perhaps he is lying. Or perhaps he genuinely doesn't know that rainwater is still seeping in. Nevertheless, unless we have grounds for claiming that the record has been forged or tampered with, we can't easily deny that Bob's statement has been made. So what does this have to do with my topic today? Well, let's consider another record. An email I've sent you stating that two cities are 3,000 kilometres apart. If you feel this is disputable or inaccurate, you will probably see it as misinformation rather than information. But no matter how much you doubt that my proposition may be called information, or how strongly you deny the truth of what I wrote, you have a record of what I told you, and you will find it hard to deny that I have stated it. Nor can you simply equate the email with the information that I have stated this proposition. Rather, the email has performed my act of stating it. There is a complexity of meaning here, which the concept of records as mere information is not rich enough to embrace. Similar issues arise when we look at data elements in a database. At first sight, no one seems to be making statements. No one is affirming that they can vouch for the data. Databases give the impression of presenting us with objective and uncontroversial facts. Nevertheless, when we encounter an element of data, such as Fred's address is Rose Villa, we must acknowledge that it could be wrong if he has never lived there, or out of date if he has moved away. Or, as we've seen, it may be ambiguous. Fred may have some link to Rose Villa, but we're unsure whether to consider it his address. A database entry does not represent an autonomous fact. It represents a proposition that someone has stated. A proposition we may consider true, or false, or simply ambiguous. Perhaps then, rather than defining records as data, we should define persistent data as records. More specifically, we could argue that they are records of statements or assertions, representations of claims that humans, or computers programmed by humans, make about the world. Like other records, data are always entangled with the contexts of their production. The information management discipline, of course, sees things differently. From an information management perspective, we can have objectively correct data if we work to rectify errors. When organizations use data to communicate with customers, forecast market trends, or plan advertising campaigns, data quality is perceived as essential. The data cleansing industry exists to meet these needs. However, data cleansing is a matter of information management, not records management. What's more, not all records represent statements. Some represent questions or instructions when creators of records make an inquiry or get someone else to do something. Some represent commitments when creators of records undertake to do something themselves. Some bring about changes in the world. For example, a deed of sale, represents the act of selling you my house. A letter of dismissal dismisses you from my employment. A will bequeaths you my possessions. These records do not merely make statements or send information about sales, dismissals, or bequests. They perform the acts concerned. Similarly, when I write, "I apologize," or "I promise" in an email, I perform the act of apologizing or promising. In each case, I achieve the act by representing myself as performing it. So by regulating human behavior, creating obligations, or establishing social relationships, records play a role in shaping the world. They are not so much factual information assets as representations of actions performed and propositions asserted. Any informational qualities they have depend on those representations. So I hope we can now begin to see the shape of a relationship between records and information. A record persists after an action has been performed. Researchers can use it to obtain information about that action, but also information about other topics. A will, for example, can provide information about what items were bequeathed to whom, but wills can also supply information about family connections, charitable impulses, and religious beliefs of testators. Hilary Jenkinson described how records of the English royal wardrobe were used to obtain information about the history of medicine, and how audit accounts provided information about the chronology of Shakespeare's plays. To other researchers, the same records might also have supplied information about paper, ink, or handwriting. We can acquire information by using records, even when conveying information wasn't the record's original purpose. And when we use records in which writers informed recipients of propositions, the information we can gain need not be only the information that the writers sought to convey. And, as we've seen, information is just one of many affordances that records supply. Of course, records professionals have to work in a world where information and data are constantly emphasized, where digital records are created and maintained within what are called information systems, where data underpin policy decisions, marketing and investment strategies, and advances in science and medicine, and where information governance sits high on many corporate agendas. The language that carries weight in the corridors of power is the language of data and information. And records professionals undoubtedly need to adopt this language in order to convince resource allocators that they can contribute to the 21st century digital landscape. Nevertheless, this doesn't mean that they have to dismiss the concept of the record as an irrelevance from a former age. 20 years ago, Trevor Littleton pointed out that records professionals often find legal definitions of records problematic. They must use them in their daily work, Littleton said, but they need not accept them as the sole foundation of their thinking. Similarly, I would suggest they can use the language of data and information when it is politically necessary, while accepting that it is inadequate for a full understanding of the theory and practice of records and archives. Even at the edge of the information society, we must recognise that the keeping of records is not identical to managing information. It is a distinct concept that focuses on maintaining records in ways that enhance their ability to provide not only information, but evidence, memory, ideas, and inspirations. Thank you very much.
Now, I think we will have some time for some questions, and I imagine that's been a really interesting, wide-ranging discussion, so it would have prompted quite a few things. If I could start, Geoffrey, I must admit, I did take some heart at the end when you mentioned or alluded to political expediency in terms of interposing ourselves in those spaces of information governance and the like. And certainly that has resonance with, I think, the position of the ASA and the conversations that we've been having about where we sit. In terms of the actual practice of an archivist and records person, how do you think it differentiates ultimately in that point of practice around what's distinctive? How would you encapsulate that?
Yes, thank you, Kylie. You quite rightly raised the question of the politics that are at issue here. And I think every time I have spoken to an audience on this subject, that has been the question in the forefront of many, many people's minds. Yes, they say, we have reservations about an information agenda. Yes, we recognise that concepts of records and archives cannot simply be equated with some kind of vanilla information. But when we are talking to our board of directors, to our ministers, to those in positions of influence and authority, we find that we need to use the language of information, because the language of information resonates with those people in a way that the language of records and archives does not. And I don't have a problem with that. It seems to me, yes, of course, we have to, just as when we are working in the search room, in the reading room, we adjust our language to accommodate the expectations and understandings of our users. So when we are talking to our management, we need to adjust our language in a way that works for them. But what I feel is important is that we do so with appropriate reservations, appropriate mental reservations. Yes, of course, we adopt a language that works, a language that will achieve results, a language that will establish our place around the table where we want to sit. But using that language does not, I think, mean, in fact, I strongly believe, using that language does not mean that we have to abandon our own professional principles. It does not mean that we do not have our own understandings, which we also bring to those discussions, whatever language we choose to use in forwarding our arguments. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a stab at it.
It's a good start. I think we'll take some questions.
Isn't that response all about spin?
I'm having a little difficulty in hearing you, but I think you asked if it's all about spin?
Yes, you did.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Well, in a sense, yes, I think in a sense you're right, because I don't like the word spin because it has slightly derogatory connotations, but at the end of the day, if we are to succeed in conveying the message that we want to convey, we may need to be prepared. Yes, I'll use the word just once. We may need to spin the message in a way that works.
Thank you, Geoffrey. About 20 years ago, Frank Upwood described what you're describing now, I think, as our secret agenda. We have to operate in the world of knowledge and data and information, but we really know what records are. My question is not, do we have to do that? Yes, we do. My question is, how do we protect ourselves from feedback? How do we protect our understanding of record from becoming corrupted by having to deal on a daily basis with different concepts that we can't explain to people the difference between what we're about and what they're about. We have to operate in that environment. But increasingly, it seems to me, a lot of us are adopting the intellectual frameworks, the concepts of the world in which we are forced to operate. And our understanding of record is becoming corrupted.
Yes.
Is there any way we can protect ourselves?
Yeah, I think the danger you're identifying is a very real one, and I have to be honest, I don't have easy answers to it. I come to events like this to try to preach this message, and I hope that to some extent I am preaching to a sympathetic audience here. Quite clearly, our sense of professional identity and professional community is at stake here, and it is events of this kind that allow us to reinforce our own professional understandings. But having said that, I absolutely accept that for most of us in this room, we're probably spending 95% of our time in an environment where we are having to relate to deal with people who see the world rather differently than the way that we do. I don't have any easy solutions to offer. I do have to say that I think we have to be constantly aware of this as an issue, constantly be on our guard, and be very watchful about falling into the trap of mentally signing up to the agenda that is being put to us all the time. We need to bear in mind that records and archives are distinctive, that we have our own distinctive professional understandings, and if we lose sight of those, then I think our professional identity and our professional future is at serious risk.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. And I don't want to belabor the last couple of questions you had, but it's an interesting area because what we're talking about are two different things. One is the language of the discipline, and the other one is communication. And if sometimes you communicate with a whole bunch of different people, and you do tailor. That's part of how we operate as a society. Is you tailor what you're saying so that people understand you, and so that's fine. Sometimes a hard concept, if you can explain it to a 4-year-old, you probably understand it quite well. So we shouldn't be afraid of tailoring our language. And I don't think we should also be afraid about being under threat, I suppose, of having the discipline diluted in some way, because to a certain extent, it should be more proactive about how we think about the concepts that we hold on to, because we should be open to critical self-reflection. Much better to criticise your own thinking rather than have others do it for you. And so I actually don't think it's an unhealthy thing, and we shouldn't feel embattled about it, but it's quite obvious that you don't sit around, as you say, you don't sit around a boardroom table and bang on about issues that belong to your discipline. What you do is you communicate it in the forum that you're in.
Yes, I think the really hard question here is how we can use the language of the information society to convey our own concepts to a wider audience. It's clearly what we need to try to do, but it's not. There are no simple answers. The language that we are expected to use, it seems to me, is barely capable of conveying those concepts. And I freely admit to being in some difficulty to seeing how we square that circle. But I am very much, very, very conscious that it is a circle that we need to find a way of squaring.
I think it's just a variation on the main theme. Where I come from, and I don't mean Canberra, there's a saying, I don't care, call me a pot, just don't put me into the oven. And I think on one hand, it kind of reflects all definitions. Sometimes you can sort of kill yourself with defining the things, but you need to get on. But on the other hand, it actually shows that definitions are important. What if someone really thinks you're a pot and knows that by definition a pot is put into the oven, so you should sort of kind of proceed with that, so you're in danger. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. But personally, just listening to all that, and I always had the problem with, yes, information feels like something more intangible, something more abstract. You can't quantify this. what's wrong with sort of going out? I go to different societies, records management, societies, events, information management. You didn't even touch on the knowledge management people who think they're doing a completely different thing altogether. But being in the government archives, I think it's kind of useful sort of saying whatever you call information, whatever is in your information system, whatever you call your data, under the Archives Act, this is government records and this is what you should be doing. So in a way it's kind of felt empowering. So why can't we continue this kind of conversation with the people who think what they're doing? We don't need to rename things for them, but we just explain what we mean by this.
Yes, I think there is a layer of further difficulty here, and you're quite right to mention knowledge management, which I decided not to talk about because I thought the water was quite muddy enough without adding them into the mix. But the people who earn their living in these disciplines, and knowledge management is an exceptionally good example of this, are also, I think, very unclear about what they themselves understand by the terminology that they use. So that when one is attempting to have a discussion with a knowledge management specialist or an information manager, one is on very, very slippery ground, because not only are we trying to convey our concepts using language that isn't particularly hospitable to conveying those concepts, but we're also attempting to do that to an audience that I think, frankly, is more than a little woolly about its own understanding of the concepts that it's preaching. So there are some real difficulties here. There's a real precipice off the edge of which we could very easily fall.
Yeah. If I can comment there, I mean, one of the things I find for archivists and records professionals is that a key point of difference for us in our practice is the fact that we have, even if we're not working in a government records context necessarily, but there is a legislative touchstone, thanks to the prescience of others, that when we come into this space, you know, we can say, well, there's actually some legislation which provides a framework for a large amount of our professional practice where it happens in government and universities and some other organisations. So that's a key point of difference for us, and I think it's, however imperfect that legislation might be, it does help ground us in a particular space that those other allied areas don't have, and we need to defend that robustly. It's critical.
Yes, I would agree with that, although I think with the proviso that the legislative framework tends to work much better for those of us working in government and public sector, and perhaps in an institutional setting more generally. For people working with personal papers and the like, it tends to be less helpful. I also sometimes feel that even the legislation is a bit of a double-edged sword, because very often the way the legislation is framed is helpful only up to a point, and one finds oneself wishing they had phrased things a little differently. Although it wasn't something that I touched on in my talk, I think the issue of communicating with legislators and with the legal community is also another area both of potential benefit but also of potential difficulty, because there can very often and very easily be a linguistic gulf between the language that we use and the language that the legal community chooses to employ. So yes, absolutely, you're right, but even that one is not as simple as it might be.
No, it's true.
Thank you. I was wondering, in those conversations around the table with the executive, what kind of, and this is a horrible phrase, but I'm going to use it anyway, what's the value proposition that the record keeper, whether or not he or she is hiding their record keepingness or being out and proud, brings to that conversation? I mean, I feel there's a very strong re-embracing, very encouraging re-embracing of the core work around appraisal, of strategic record keeping, of defining record keeping requirements into contemporary systems and identifying areas of risk. So that's, for me, one such value proposition. What would you say would be others?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? And we need a whole conference on that quite clearly. I guess my quick short answer is that, again, it very, very much depends on where you are working. The value proposition that you as an archivist or a records manager are going to bring to the table if you're working in a government ministry, for example, is almost certainly going to be very differently slanted to the proposition that you're going to bring if you're working in, say, a university. And I think the key to success here is looking at the working context in which you find yourselves and say, what are the arguments that are going to be strongest in this particular context? And accountability, which is so often mentioned in this connection, seems to me to be very much a case in point. If you are employed by an organisation where accountability is valued, then quite clearly that is going to be one of the strong cards that you will bring to any discussion. But if you are working in an organisation, perhaps I'm thinking somewhere that might consider itself more at the leading edge of product development or research rather than a conventional bureaucratic organisation, then I suspect what you're going to be told is actually what we're interested in accountability. Well, yes, that's all very well and good, but we have other priorities here. And I think my short answer to the question is look at the context in which you find yourself and adjust your argument according to what is going to work for and resound with the particular audience, the particular management that you're finding you have to deal with. So I can't, I'm afraid, give a one-size-fits-all answer to that question, but I absolutely agree that it's an extremely important question for all of us.
Excellent. All right. That's probably a good place to draw that session to a close. I have a few housekeeping matters, but before I do that, can you just join with me in thanking Geoffrey?
Mm.